Almost all the peoples of Europe speak so-called Indo-European languages. The Indo-European languages include languages such as the Germanic, Romance, Celtic, Slavic, Greek, Armenian, Iranian, Indian, and other language groups. Historians and linguists agree that the Proto-Indo-Europeans, or the original Indo-Europeans, they lived many thousand years ago somewhere in southern Russia or perhaps in Central Asia. And from there they migrated to all those different areas, all the way from Europe to India and elsewhere. Now, obviously, today the inhabitants of all those areas and all those different nations, they have very different physical appearances. So obviously, the Indo-Europeans that settled in all those areas, they must have mixed and assimilated with other ethnic groups. And we find that the most important ethnic group that the peoples of northwestern Europe assimilated with were the so-called Lost 10 Tribes of Israel. And that's the subject of this video. The ancient nation of Israel consisted of 12 tribes, but in the 8th century BC, the Assyrian Empire invaded the kingdom of Israel, which consisted of the 10 northern tribes of Israel, and conquered it, and deported 10 of the Israelite tribes and settled them in northern areas of the Assyrian Empire. And we read about that in the Old Testament in the book of 2 Kings. Then the king of Assyria came up throughout all the land, and went up to Samaria and besieged it 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria, and placed them in Hala and in Heyerdahl by the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. And also, therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them out of his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah only. Unquote from 2 Kings chapter 17 verses 5 to 6 and verse 18. Remember the last part? There was none left but the tribe of Judah only. They soon left those areas and became known as the Lost 10 Tribes of Israel. The 2 remaining tribes in the kingdom of Judah became known as Jews, because Jew simply means a man of Judah. But through historical evidence, as well as Bible prophecies and other kinds of secular evidence, we can trace the 10 tribes of Israel to Europe. The Nordic peoples descend from the Aser and Vanar tribes. According to the Icelandic historian Snorri Sturluson, who lived 1179 to 1241, the Nordic peoples of Scandinavia, Iceland, and northern Germany came from southern Russia, from where they had migrated under a chieftain priest called Odin. Snorri wrote about this in 2 books, the Younger Edda, written approximately 1220, and the Heimskringla, which is also known as the Chronicles of the Kings of Norway, which was written approximately 1230. Snorri wrote that the ancestors of the Nordic peoples were 2 tribes called Aser and Vanar. These names are similar to 2 of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, who were called Asher and Dan. Aser and Vanar, Asher and Dan. And according to Snorri, they lived in a city called Asgard on the river Don, close to what today is the Russian city of Azov. Snorri also wrote that Odin had great estates south of the Caucasus Mountains, which happens to be right next to where the Assyrians had placed the 10 tribes of Israel, including the 2 tribes of Asher and Dan. Snorri Sturluson describes the homeland of the Vanar tribe. We quote, "On the south side of the mountains, which lie outside all inhabited lands, runs a river through Svyriad, which means Russia, which is probably called Tanais, but was formerly called Tanakvisl or Vanakvisl, and which runs into the Black Sea. The country of the people of the Vanakvisl was called Vanaland or Vanaheim, and the river separates the three parts of the world, of which the easternmost part is called Asia and the westernmost Europe. Unquote from Snorri Sturluson's Ynglingasaga Part 1. The river called Tanakvisl or Vanakvisl or Tanais, that's the river Don, because its ancient Greek name was Tanais. And the Vana tribe, they lived adjacent to the Aser tribe whose chief was Odin. And we again quote from Snorri, quote, the country east of the Tanakvisl in Asia was called Asaland or Asaheim, and the chief city in that land was called Asgard. In that city was a chief called Odin, and it was a great place for sacrifice. It was the custom there that 12 temple priests should both direct the sacrifices and also judge the people. They were called Dia or Drotna, and all the people served and obeyed them. Odin was a great and very far-traveled warrior who conquered many kingdoms, and he was so successful that in every battle the victory was on his side. Unquote from part 2 of the Ynglingasaga. And then after a war between the Aser and Vana tribes, which ended without either of them prevailing, Odin led the tribes to northern Europe, and we again quote from Snorri. There goes a great mountain barrier, that is the Caucasus Mountains, from northeast to southwest, which divides the greater Scythia from other kingdoms. South of this mountain ridge it is not far to Turkland, where Odin had great possessions. In those times the Roman chiefs went wide around in the world, subduing to themselves all people, and on this account many chiefs fled from their domains. But Odin, having foreknowledge and magic sight, knew that his posterity would come to settle and dwell in the northern half of the world. He therefore set his brothers Ve and Vilja over Asgard, and he emigrated with all the Goths and a great many other people, first westward to Gardarrike, that is Russia, and then south to Saxland, that is Saxony. He had many sons, and after having subdued an extensive kingdom in Saxland, he set his sons to rule the country. He himself went northward to the Baltic Sea and took up his abode in an island which is called Odin's Island on Funen. Unquote. By the way, Odin's Island, that is the city of Odense, which today is the third largest city in Denmark, and literally in modern Danish means Odin's Island, Odins Ø, Odense. So, in the Younger Edda, Snorri adds the detail that the Roman general who was making these wars, which caused Odin and the Aser and Vana tribes to migrate, was none other than Pompey the Great. Pompey the Great was fighting King Mithridates of Pontus in the Third Mithridatic War in the 70s to 60s BC, and that war took place in Asia Minor and in the Black Sea region, including the Crimea Peninsula. Now the Crimea Peninsula, it borders the Sea of Azov on the east, and on the western side of the Sea of Azov is the city of Azov, and that was possibly where Asgard of old was situated. So this sets the time of the Aser and Vana migration to the 70s to 60s BC. Olaf Rudbeck and Peter Frederik Suhn. Snorri's account of this migration is confirmed by the greatest Swedish historian of his age, Olaf Rudbeck the Elder, who lived 1630 to 1702 in his main work At Land eller Mannheim, which was written between 1677 and 1702. And also by the greatest Danish historian of his age, Peter Frederik Suhn, who lived 1728 to 1798 in his monumental work Historia af Danmark, the History of Denmark, 1772 to 1828. A lot of it was also published after his death. Both Rudbeck and Suhn, they did not trace the origin of the Nordic peoples all the way back to the Israelites, but Peter Frederik Suhn, he did write when he was speaking of the Nordic peoples that, quote, the ancestors of us, the Germans and the Celts, lived together in Asia Minor. And that's a quote from Peter Frederik Suhns book om Odin og den hedniske gudlære og gudstjeneste ud i Norden from 1771. The Danes arrived in Denmark from the 1st to 3rd century AD. According to the Danish historian Johannes Brøndsted, the ancestors of the Danes arrived in Denmark from the east in two waves. The first shortly after the birth of Christ and the second in the 3rd century. Johannes Brøndsted was a capable and respected archaeologist and historian, as well as the director of the National Museum of Denmark. And Brøndsted wrote this in volume 1 of Politikens Danmarks Historie, and Politiken Publishers is one of the largest publishers in Denmark, and they also publish the liberal newspaper Politiken, which is one of the biggest newspapers in this country, and Politiken is essentially the New York Times of Denmark. And Johannes Brøndsted wrote that the ancestors of most modern Danes, they migrated into Denmark in two waves. One shortly after the birth of Christ, and another wave in the 3rd century AD, and that they came from the region north of the Black Sea and brought along with them the Runic alphabet and the rye grain. And by the way, rye bread made out of the rye grain, it's the most popular bread in Denmark today. So we quote from Johannes Brøndsted. Shortly after the birth of Christ, in other words, in the start of the older Roman era, an immigration must have taken place into Denmark of decidedly long-skulled people of the Nordic type. It must also be assumed that a new immigration of the same type of people, that is, people of the Nordic type, must have taken place in the younger Roman era, probably sometime in the 200s. This way we get a picture, albeit lacking in details, that sometime in the 200s an invasion of Denmark from the east took place. It was a conquest which first subdued Zealand, then eastern Funen, and then the advance stopped, because the attempt to conquer the eastern parts of the country failed. By chasing out the Heruli tribe in the younger Roman era, the Danes got control of the southern regions of the Nordic countries, which became their future homeland, called Denmark. Jordanes, approximately 550 AD, says concerning this place that he's probably speaking of the Danes, that they claim to be the tallest of all the peoples of Scandinavia, and this fits with the anthropological measurings of skeletons from Denmark from the Roman era, which show a rise in the average height of the males. It can therefore not be denied that the thought of the Danes coming into our country sometime in the 200s can find some support both in archaeological and historical sources, even though the latter are both late and scarce. The theory is supported by the distribution of the ending of certain place names on Funen, such as Lev in the northeast and Inge in the southwest, which H.V. Clausen wrote was connected with a presumed conquest originating from Zealand. Unquote from Johannes Brøndsted, Politikens Danmarks Historie, Volume 1, pages 490-492, and that was published in 1963. Israelite Goths and Israelite Aser and Vaner. The Norwegian archaeologist Christen Døsland also writes about two waves of Israelite immigration into Scandinavia in his book Norrønerfolket i ophav og vandring, which means the origin and migrations of the Norse people, which was published in 1946. Christen Døsland calls the first wave Israel Goths and places their entry into Scandinavia approximately 500 BC. He may be referring to the same wave as Brøndsted, who places it around the birth of Christ. And he identifies the second wave as the Aner and Vaner tribes spoken of by Snorri Sturluson of Iceland, and places this second immigration wave approximately AD 300, which is almost the same date set by Johannes Brøndsted. And we quote from Christen Døslands bog Norrønerfolket i ophav og vandring. At an early time, a wave of peoples branched out from the Israel Goths by the Black Sea and in the Danube province, and took the route toward the north. These were the first of the descendants of the peoples of the 10 tribes, which came came to Scandinavia. Many of them must have arrived here as early as approximately 500 BC, while their Scythian kinsmen in the east continued to raid and conquer in Asia. The first immigrants were not Aser, but called themselves by the name derived from Goths, and in Old Norse it is called Gauta, and in Swedish Götar, and in English Geats. These Gauta came to Sweden, but we have also preserved a variation of the name Goth in Gotland. In Denmark they became Jutes, after whom Jutland is named. The change from G to J is very common in North Germanic languages. Unquote from Christen Døslands bog Norrønerfolket i ophav og vandring. Døsland continues to explain that the myth of the treacherous Jøtner, in Norwegian called Jotner, and in Danish Jætter, in Swedish also Jætter. So these treacherous Jøtner, which in mythology were the giants of the North mythology, that was actually a derogatory mythologization of the people of the first Israel Gothic wave of immigrants. So they were actual people, but they were turned into a mythological people known as giants. The second wave of Israelites, called Aser and Vaner, conquered Scandinavia after approximately AD 300 and depicted the former inhabitants, which were actually their Israelite kinsmen, in a derogatory way in order to justify their conquest. But in fact, the people on whom the Jøtner myth, the myth of the giants, was based, it was based upon people who were neither giants nor treacherous, but actually were the descendants of the first wave of Israel Goths. And we again quote from Christen Døslands book. Of course, we find most of the information about the Jøtner in the Eddas, and that is when we understand to interpret them correctly. When the Jøtner always get such a derogatory mentioning in the myths, it is for this reason. Several centuries after they had settled in Scandinavia, from approximately AD 300, came a new flood of people migrating north. It was their kinsmen, the Aser, who in the meantime had removed themselves so far from their original Israelite culture and now appeared as ruthless conquerors. After the Aser had defeated the Jøtner, they expressed their contempt for the conquered people by portraying them and their ancestors as treacherous workers of iniquity. Unquote. The kingdom of Sweden was founded when the tribes, the Swedes and the Geats and the Goots, which were the inhabitants of the island of Gotland, that they united. The names Goths and Geats and Goots, they are all close to the name of the Israelite tribe of Gad, which was among the first of the tribes of Israel to be deported. We can therefore trace the Israelite tribes of Asher, Dan and Gad to Scandinavia. And by the way, if you would like to read more about the subject of the lost tribes of Israel, you can buy my new book, The Lost 10 Tribes of Israel in Europe. That's 352 pages long, and you can buy it on Amazon. And the price, excluding postage and handling, for the paperback version is $9, and for the hardcover version, $17. You can also get it in ebook, a Kindle ebook, and that costs $2. Of course, that's there's no postage and handling there. And among other things in this, my new book, there's a lot of sources, both from Scandinavia and Germany and France and Belgium, that have never before been translated into English language literature about the lost 10 tribes of Israel. So you can read about it in this, my new book. Thor Heyerdahl. A rather recent affirmation of the eastern origin of the Norsemen was made by the Norwegian adventurer and ethnographer Thor Heyerdahl. Thor Heyerdahl is especially famous for the Kon-Tiki expedition, where he sought to prove a link between the Polynesians and South America. As the last project of his life, Heyerdahl wanted to test the veracity of Snorri's stories about Odin and the Aesir and Vanir originating from somewhere north of the Caucasus Mountains. So he traveled to Azerbaijan, where he met the Christian Udi or Odin people, which, unlike most other people in that country, had not converted to Islam. And he also made archaeological digs in the southern Russian city Azov on the Don River, which may have been where Asgard of old was situated. And Azov also starts with an AZ sound like Asgard, and the Russian word for city is Gorod, so Asgard and Asgorod would also mean Aser city or Asher city. Heyerdahl concluded that Odin and the Aesir and Vanir tribes had indeed lived there and had migrated to Scandinavia, just like Snorri and the other Nordic historians had written, and he summarized his findings in the book Jagten på Odin. And we quote from Jagten på Odin, which means the search for Odin or the hunt for Odin, and was published in 2002. It is in a plain and simple language that Snorri Sturluson has written about Odin's northward travel from the world's old cultural centers to the northern edge of Europe. In a geographical summary which is impossible to misunderstand, Snorri first takes us from his own world in Western Europe through Gibraltar and the Mediterranean Sea to the Black Sea. There he places Odin in the court of the Aesir on the eastern side of the border river Tana-Issus Delta, where Azov is today. Then he determines the time when this event took place. It was when the Romans marched into the Caucasus area. Then we get a whole new travel route for Odin's flight, which also does not require any interpretation. These people were obviously not gods, but they were also no ordinary entourage who set their course towards the northern part of the world when the Romans entered Turkey. With his entourage of Aesir and adopted Vanir, and under pressure from the invincible Romans, he starts an immigration out of the Caucasus area which is under threat. The route went from the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea and was forced to follow the great rivers through Russia's impenetrable primeval forests. As Snorri points out, first west through Gardarike, the Viking name for Russia, either through the Black Sea coasts of southern Russia and up the Dnieper, or directly up the Don, and then pulling the boats across land, which the Vikings also did later, from the southern flowing rivers of Russia to the western flowing rivers of Latvia and Estonia, and into the Baltic Sea. Unquote from Thors Heyerdahl and Per Liljestrøm's book Jagten på Odin, The Search for Odin, page 36, and that was published in 2002. The many Odins. There were several Odins, not just one person. Peter Frederik Suhm writes of at least 3 different Odins. Odin was most likely not a name, but rather a title, which meant something like Lord or Chief or Number One or Prime Minister. The name Odin could be a variation of the Hebrew word Adon, which means Lord. For example, Isaac Moseson writes in the book The Word, the Dictionary that reveals the Hebrew source of English from 1989, quote, "The Norse god Odin appears to be another form of Adon. If Teutonic god Woden is related, then Wednesday is an old German version of the Lord's Day. Biblical Joseph, whose Adonic looks were legendary, was the Adon or ruler over all the land of Egypt, mentioned in Genesis chapter 45, verse 9. Unquote from Isaac Moseson's book, The Word, the Dictionary that reveals the Hebrew source of English, published in 1989. And in the Russian language, Odin means one. For example, if you open Google Translate and type in the English word one and translate it into Russian, Google Translate will translate it into Odin, simply spelled O-D-I-N, or in Russian it's pronounced something like Ajin, or something like that. The lost 10 tribes, also known as House of Omri, Cimmeri, and Cimmerians. When the 10 tribes of Israel were living in the Holy Land, they came under Assyrian domination a long time before they were deported. While they were still living in the land of Israel, the Assyrians referred to the northern kingdom of Israel as the House of Omri, or Bit Cumri, similar to the Hebrew Bet Omri. The American archaeologist E. Raymond Capt proved in the book Missing Links Discovered in Assyrian Tablets from 1985 that the Assyrians and other peoples in the Middle East called the deported Israelites by various other names such as Comri, Cimmerians, Saka, and Scythians. Many had already made this connection between the lost 10 tribes of Israel and the Cimmerians and Scythians, but E. Raymond Capt was the first one to conclusively prove this missing link. We quote from E. Raymond Capt. To summarize, we have observed from the Assyrian documents, such as tablets and inscriptions, that the Israelites were called Cumri or Comri by the Assyrians before their captivity. However, after the reign of the king of Assyria, Sargon II, who reigned 721 to 705 BC, that name is never mentioned again. Then, around 707 BC, a people known as Gemira or Gamera are recorded as living among the Mannai. Their territory was only a few miles from the Medes in the very places where the scriptures state the northern 10-tribed kingdom of Israel had been placed just a few years previously. We have noted that the names Gimir, Gemira, and Gamera could easily be corruptions of Cumri or Comri, the Assyrian name for the Israelites. The names Sake or Saka, in other words meaning Scythians, are probably derived from the Isaka or House of Isaac. It is further noted that the Assyrian name Gamira is translated into Cimmerian, and that's from a translation by Professor Leroy Waterman in the Royal Correspondence of the Assyrian Empire, published in 1930. Although the belief, based upon biblical and historical records, that the Scythians and Cimmerians are descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel has long been held by some Bible scholars for many years, archaeological evidence has been lacking. That is no longer the case. The clay cuneiform letters found in Ashurbanipal's Royal Library in Kijunjik are the missing links connecting the Israelites to the peoples of Western Europe and America who can trace their roots to the Scythians and Cimmerians. It can now truly be said, archaeology has solved two great mysteries, both occurring at the same time in history. Number one, what happened to the countless thousands of Israelites that disappeared into Assyrian captivity? And number two, where did the countless thousands of Scythians and Cimmerians come from? Both mysteries no longer exist. The so-called lost tribes of Israel were never really lost. They only lost their identity during their captivity in Assyria. Unquote from E. Raymond Capt, Missing Links Discovered in Assyrian Tablets, pages 122 to 123. The Behistun stone. A further piece of evidence is the Behistun stone. This is a giant inscription on a rock wall in western Iran written by King Darius the Great of Persia sometime around 515 BC. The Behistun stone is unique in that it is written in 3 different languages and therefore provides clues as to what different languages call different ethnic groups. The 3 languages are Babylonian, also known as Akkadian, and number 2 Elamite, also known as Susian, and number 3 Persian. On the inscription, the word Cana, in other words Canaan, occurs 28 times, and Armenia, that was where the lost 10 tribes were placed, also occurs frequently. But in the Persian and Elamite rendering, one ethnic group is called Saka, while in the Babylonian rendering, they are called Gimiri. This shows that the Gimiri or Cimmerians and the Saka or some Scythians, were one and the same people. That's again from E. Raymond Capt's book. And further to this quote by E. Raymond Capt, the area where the Cimmerians were found is almost exactly where Snorri Sturluson of Iceland wrote that Odin had great estates at the time when he led the Asa and Vana tribes to Scandinavia. The English historian and theologian George Rawlinson, who lived 1810 to 1902, and who was the younger brother of the famous Assyriologist Henry Rawlinson, agreed with this identification in the notes of one of his most famous works, his translation and commentary of the history of Herodotus. We quote, "We have reasonable grounds for regarding the Cimmeri or Cimmerians, who first appeared on the confines of Assyria and Media in the 7th century BC, and the Sake of the Behistun stone nearly 2 centuries later, as identical with Bet Cumri of Samaria, or the 10 tribes of the house of Israel." Unquote. Danish historian identifies the Cimmerians as deported Israelites. The connection between the lost 10 tribes of Israel and the Cimmerians, which later migrated to the area north of the Black Sea, is no far-fetched theory. In 1988, the Danish Assyriologist Anne K.G. Christensen wrote "Who are the Cimmerians and where did they come from?", which was published by the Royal Academy of Sciences and Letters, the most prestigious scientific society in Denmark, whose meetings are sometimes attended in person by the King of Denmark. Here Anne Christensen showed that the Cimmerians from the areas north of the Black Sea were in fact the lost 10 tribes of Israel. We quote, "According to Herodotus and Greek tradition as a whole, the original home of the Cimmerians was north of the Black Sea in what was then known as Scythia. In spite of persistent archaeological excavations, however, it has not been possible to determine the presence of Cimmerians in Scythia or elsewhere. The question of the origin of the Cimmerians, therefore, remains somewhat of a mystery. The author of the present investigation wishes to show with an analysis of all available contemporaneous evidence from the time of Sargon II and Esarhaddon, in other words, the 8th to 9th centuries BC, that the Cimmerians were in fact identical with Israelites deported from northern Israel after the fall of Samaria in 722 BC. Large parts of these deportees were then posted, or indeed settled, in the Zagros area under Assyrian supervision and in garrisons along the frontier between Assyria and Urartu, in other words Armenia, where we find them in 714. Unquote from Anne K.G. Christensen. Who were the Cimmerians and where did they come from? Cimmerians and Scythians driven into Europe and Central Asia. Ancient Greek historians such as Strabo, who wrote in the first decades of the 1st century AD, tell us that the Cimmerians battled one kingdom after another in Asia Minor until they were finally driven out of Asia Minor by the Scythians sometime around 525 and settled in the Balkans. Ancient Greek historians also indicate that some of the Scythians were forced out of the Persian Empire into what today is Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan. These Scythians were called Massagetae by the Greek writers, which means the Great Saga Horde. Most modern historians believe that the Scythians were not one ethnic group, but rather a collection of different ethnic groups which happened to inhabit the same geographical territory. The Scythians were probably not all Israelites, but there were no doubt some Israelites among the Scythians. The Cimmerians, on the other hand, seem to have been Israelites, all of them. Cimmerians and Scythians become one with Germanic and Celtic peoples. In ancient times, the steppes of Eastern Europe often received invaders from Asia. All mainstream historical accounts record that when the Cimmerians lived in the area north of the Black Sea around 650 to 500 BC, they were driven west by the Scythians, who in turn were driven west by the Sarmatians. From here, the descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel some known as Cimmerians and others as Scythians, moved into areas where peoples speaking Germanic and Celtic languages lived and ended up taking up the language of the Germanic and Celtic-speaking tribes. That is why the descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel today speak Germanic, Celtic, and Romance languages. If you think that sounds far-fetched, consider that until the 1940s, most Jews also spoke a Germanic language called Yiddish. The Norwegian author Christian Døsland explains in Norrønerfolket i ophav og vandring, the origin and migrations of the Norse people, published in 1946, that the Israelite and quote-unquote Aryan tribes mixed, but also that we should expect the descendants of the 10 tribes to be far more numerous than the Jews. We quote from Christian Døsland's book. We can expect to find many more descendants from the people of the 10 tribes who in part became very intermixed with quote-unquote Aryan peoples, so that the Israelite stock came up to make up a culture-bearing elite. We must also remember that the birth rate of these people must have been very high, because they believed that the blessing of life primarily consisted of reproducing, of getting numerous descendants. Unquote from Christian Døsland, The Origin and Migrations of the Norse People, page 5, published in 1946. Sharon Turner traces the Anglo-Saxons to Armenia. The English historian Sharon Turner, who lived 1768 to 1847, published The History of the Anglo-Saxons, volume 1-4, between 1799 and 1805. Turner's history had a profound impact on the historiography for the succeeding 50 years. Sharon Turner also convinced Isaac Disraeli and his family to abandon Judaism and become members of the Church of England. One of the latter's sons was Benjamin Disraeli, who was Prime Minister of Britain twice between 1868 and 1880. Sharon Turner identified the ancestors of the Anglo-Saxons and Saxons as the Cimmerians and Scythians, and traced the origin of the Anglo-Saxons all the way to Armenia. In the centuries prior to the birth of Christ, Armenia was made up both of the modern Republic of Armenia as well as most of the eastern part of modern Turkey. We quote from Sharon Turner, "This important fact of a part of Armenia having been called Sagasina is mentioned by Strabo in another place, and seems to give a geographical locality to our primeval ancestors, and to account for the Persian words that occur in the Saxon language, as they must have come into Armenia from the northern regions of Persia. That some of the divisions of this people were really called Sagasuna is obvious for Pliny, for he says that the Sacae who settled in Armenia were called Sagasani, which is but Sagasuna spelled by a person unacquainted with the meaning of the combined words. And the name Sagasena, which they gave to the part of Armenia they occupied, is nearly the same sound as Saxonia. It is also important to remark that Ptolemy mentions a Scythian people sprung from the Sacae by the name of Saxones." Unquote from Sharon Turner's History of the Anglo-Saxons. Snorri Sturluson of Iceland in the early 13th century traced the ancestors of the Scandinavians to areas south of the Caucasus Mountains, and Sharon Turner of England in the late 18th century and early 19th century traced the ancestors of the Anglo-Saxons to historic Armenia, which included most of eastern Turkey. It would be the strangest of coincidences if Snorri and Sharon Turner were not writing about the one and the same people, and that this people was in fact the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Sharon Turner wrote that a part of the Scythians in the process of time became known as Goths, Gete and Germans. We again quote from him, "It would be impertinent to the great subject of this history to engage in a minuter discussion of the Scythian tribes. They have become better known to us in recent periods under the name of Gete and Goths, the most celebrated of their branches. In the days of Caesar, the most advanced tribes of the Scythian or Gothic race were known to the Romans under the name Germans. The Saxons were a German or Teutonic, that is, a Gothic or Scythian tribe, and of the various Scythian nations which have been recorded, the Sakai or Sakra are the people from whom the descent of the Saxons may be inferred, with the least violation of probability. Sakai Suna, or the sons of the Sakai, abbreviated into Saxon, which is the same sound as Saxon, seems a reasonable etymology of the word Saxon. The Sakai, who in Latin are called Sake, were an important branch of the Scythian nation. They were so celebrated that the Persians called all the Scythians by the name of Sake, and Pliny, who mentions this, remarks them among the most distinguished people of Scythia. Strabo places them eastward of the Caspian. From there, Turner traces the descendants of the Sake or Sakai to the Saxons and the Anglo-Saxons. Cimmerians of Jutland descend from Cimmerians. One branch of the Cimmerians migrated to Jutland. Many historians have made the connection between the Cimmerians and the Cimmerians of Jutland. Plutarch writes in The Life of Marius, we quote, "They were called at first Cimmerians and then not inappropriately Cimbri," unquote. The Stoic philosopher Posidonius, 130–50 BC, also records the Cimbri dwelling originally on the shores of the Black Sea, where they were known to the Greeks as Cimmerians. The Danish historian Peter Frederik Suhm was also convinced that the Cimmerians of northern Jutland were Cimmerians from the Black Sea region. We quote from Peter Frederik Suhm, "Since the Nordic Cimmerians are, as I will show later, one and the same people as the Cimmerians, both when it comes to their origin, name and descent, then it is safe to assume that after the first time they were driven out by the Scythians, a part of them went north, and brought the Cimmerian or Cimbrian name with them into the Nordic countries," unquote, from Peter Frederik Suhms bog, Forsøg til et udkast af en historie over folkenes oprindelse i almindelighed som en indledning til de nordiske folkes i særdeleshed, published in 1769. We therefore see that the 10 tribes of Israel migrated from the Middle East to Europe, where they intermixed or assimilated with the various tribes that spoke Indo-European languages such as Germanic and Celtic and Romance languages, and also Finnish languages. Finnish is of course not an Indo-European language, and that this is the reason why the descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel today do not speak Hebrew, but various Indo-European languages. And as I mentioned before, if you'd like to read more about the subject of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, then you can buy my book, The Lost 10 Tribes of Israel in Europe, on Amazon. And until next time, may the God of Israel bless you.